Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to sift through, stacks of interesting sources and really pull out the essential nuggets for you. If you're trying to get a quick handle on complex global trends, get those aha moments without drowning in info, you're definitely in the right place. Today, we're diving deep into a really pivotal economic story, India's future growth. The big question we're tackling is, should it keep chasing that traditional manufacturing-led growth, or should it lean into its increasingly powerful service sector? And this dive is built on some really compelling insights from economists like Rajan and Lamba, and it's all backed by some pretty solid data. Our mission, simple: unpack the most important bits from these sources, maybe uncover a few surprising facts, and connect the dots so you can really grasp the nuances here.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating, I think, is how the data just lays this debate bare. I mean, since the 1980s, India's manufacturing share of GDP has just been stuck, flatlined, really, around 15, 17%.
For that long?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And then you look at services, totally different story. They now make up, what, 54, 56% of GDP?
A huge chunk.
Wow, okay. That's a massive difference.
It really is. And the growth, I'll use some numbers. Services exports. They were 44% of total exports in fiscal year 24.
44%.
And they grew by a pretty robust 11.6% just in the following fiscal year 24-25. Now, compare that to manufacturing, industrial output. It rose just about 3.4% in FY 23-24, much lower.
Right, a big gap in growth speed.
Exactly. And even the latest PMI numbers, the Purchasing Managers Index, that snapshot of economic health. For June 2025, services PMI hit 60.7, very strong expansion.
Yeah.
Manufacturing PMI was 58.4, also strong, yeah, but still lagging behind services, consistently lagging. What's really remarkable isn't just that services are growing fast, it's that manufacturing, despite, significant government pushes, has just stayed flat. It almost feels like India isn't just choosing services, maybe it's structurally tilted that way. So what does this actually mean for a country like India? Huge population, massive potential. It sounds like the old industrial playbook might not be the only way forward. So if it's not fitting that old mold, what path is it carving? This is where that idea you mentioned, the smile curve, gets interesting.
Absolutely. The small curve concept, yeah.
Yeah.
The idea that the most value isn't necessarily in the middle, the actual making of the thing, but at the ends. The design, the R&D up front, and then the marketing, sales, and after-sales services at the other end.
And you're saying India is actually showing this in practice?
The data suggests so.
Right.
Look at India's share of global services exports. It went from about 2.9% in 2014 up to 4.3% in 2024. That's solid growth.
Okay, clear increase there.
And it's driven by these high-value sectors, IT, obviously, but also consulting, remote education, things like that. Now, let's contrast that with, say, the manufacturing initiatives, like the PLI scheme, the production-linked incentives.
Right, it's a government push to boost manufacturing.
Yeah. For electronics, it did add about $20.4 billion in exports by 2024, which sounds like a lot.
It does sound significant.
But in the grand scheme of things, that's still only about 1.8% of total global manufacturing exports. Tiny, really. So the sources really hammered this point. Services exports keep growing strongly, while manufacturing's slice of the GDP pie just isn't getting bigger despite these incentives. It seems India is finding value more in intellectual capital than just on the factory floor.
That really paints a picture of India finding its own unique spot in the global economy, leveraging strengths, not just copying others. And if a nation's strength is its people, well, this next bit from the sources on human capital is absolutely critical. The authors really stress how vital investment in education and health is. So how is India actually doing there? What's the reality on the ground?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. Progress, but also some real challenges. On education, adult literacy is now around 80.9% on average. That's up from about 74% back in 2011, so that's positive.
Okay, definite improvement.
But there are still these significant gaps. Gender gaps, male literacy is about 88%, female 81%. And big rural-urban divides, too. 90% urban literacy versus 77% rural.
Those gaps are concerning.
They are. Though, on the bright side, some states are really pushing ahead, like Tripura, Tamil Nadu, Delhi. They've crossed 95% literacy through specific drives. And their ongoing government efforts, like the big National Education Policy, the NEP 2020, it's aiming for foundational literacy for all young kids by 2025. Plus, there's significant funding, like 37,000 crore, that's about, $4.5 billion, allocated for this big school education program called Samagra Shiksha.
Okay, so efforts are being made on the education front. What about health?
Health is arguably more challenging. Public spending on healthcare is quite low, around 2.1% of GDP.
2.1%. How does that compare?
Well, economists often suggest something like 4 to 6% is needed for a really effective system in a developing country. So it's quite a bit lower. And you see the impact in the numbers. India has only about 0.8 doctors per 10,000 people.
Oh, wow.
Compare that to China, which has around 2.0. And hospital beds, only 1.4 per 1,000 people. That's way below WHO recommendations.
Right.
So, yeah, the sources make it pretty clear. Major improvements are really needed in both health and education infrastructure to support any kind of long-term growth, services or otherwise.
Yeah, those human capital issues, they have huge long-term implications for everyone, really, when you think about the global workforce and the skills needed down the line. But, beyond the economic data, the sources bring up something else, something maybe less expected. The role of governance itself, specifically democratic processes. How can things like debate and feedback actually boost economic growth? That seems a bit counterintuitive sometimes, doesn't it?
It can seem that way, yeah, because often the thinking is centralized control equals efficiency. But Rajan and Lamba argue that things like democratic debate, a free press, scrutiny, feedback loops, these actually make policies more resilient, more innovative even.
How so? Do they give examples?
Well, they point to how major reforms in India, like that NEP 2020 for education we mentioned, or various healthcare initiatives, emerged from quite extensive deliberation and consensus building. That process, while maybe slower sometimes, can lead to broader buy-in and policies that are better adapted to reality. They're less brittle, you could say. And there's studies suggesting that countries with stronger accountability, often democracies, can actually outperform autocratic regimes economically over the long run.
Interesting.
So the argument is that these democratic strengths aren't separate from the economy. They can actually complement and maybe even accelerate that service-led smile curve model we talked about, building trust, enabling complex coordination, things vital for high-value services.
That's a really powerful thought. Challenges that whole idea that top-down efficiency is always best. Makes you think about how governance really shapes economic possibilities. Okay, but let's address the elephant in the room, or at least the common critique. The idea that prioritizing services over manufacturing, well, many argue manufacturing jobs are better at lifting large numbers of people out of poverty, especially in a country like India. How do the sources tackle that?
Yeah, that's a crucial point, and the authors definitely acknowledge it. They recognize manufacturing does have indirect benefits, spillover effects, but they also point squarely at the structural limits we've seen in India's case. Remember those big government initiatives, Make in India, the PLI schemes. The goal was ambitious, aiming for manufacturing to be 25% of GDP.
Right.
But the reality, its shares basically stayed flat, even slightly dipped, from about 16.7% in FY14 to 15.9% in FY24.
Despite all the incentives.
Exactly. And the performance of those PLI incentives themselves has been, well, underwhelming, according to the targets. The sources cite figures like only about $152 billion of output achieved against a target of $500 billion. That's, only 37% achievement.
Ouch. That's quite a miss.
It is. And critically, they note that the job creation, specifically in manufacturing, has been lagging too. It hasn't delivered the massive employment boom that was hoped for. So their conclusion, based on this evidence, is pretty direct. Given these realities, India's strategic comparative advantage seems to lie more with services and investing in the human capital needed for those services.
So it's less about ignoring manufacturing, more about making a strategic choice based on what's actually happening on the ground, based on the data.
Okay, but that leads to maybe the biggest question for many people listening. Can these high-value tradable services really create jobs at the scale India needs? IT is great, but can it employ tens of millions? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe the billion-person question for India. The sources suggest yes, potentially. They point back to that PMI data. Services PMI growth consistently shows rising demand and rising employment within the sector. That composite PMI hitting 61.0 in June 2025. Employment growth was reportedly strongest in services.
Okay, so the surveys show job growth there.
Right. And while the manufacturing PMI is also strong, as we said, 58.4, its growth just hasn't translated into the same level of job creation. The linkage seems weaker there. And historical data is interesting too. It shows that the big shift in India's labor force hasn't really been from agriculture into low-end manufacturing, as you saw in East Asia.
Oh, where did they go then?
It seems there was more of a direct jump from agriculture into services and construction, skipping that traditional factory floor step for many.
Huh. That's a different pattern.
It is. And think about the examples of tradable services. Remote education delivery, telehealth consultations, crossing borders, complex software development. These aren't just creating jobs for the highly skilled person doing the task, they create ripple effects. They need support staff, local infrastructure, they drive demand in local economies.
Right, the ecosystem around those jobs.
Exactly. It's not just the programmer, it's the whole network that supports that activity. So the potential for scale, while different from factory jobs, is argued to be significant.
That really brings it home, connecting it back to how we think about future jobs and economic opportunity, not just in India, but really everywhere. Okay, so let's quickly recap our deep dive today on India's economic future. We've seen this really clear picture of the service sector's dominance and, frankly, impressive growth, standing in stark contrast to manufacturing's decades-long stagnation. A surprising economic reality, really. We looked at the critical importance of human capital education and health, where there's progress, yes, but also significant gaps that need addressing. Foundational work still to be done. We also touched on that maybe unconventional idea, the role democratic processes can play in building economic agility and resilience. And finally, we got a more nuanced view on manufacturing's job potential, acknowledging its limits based on India's actual experience, despite the traditional argument. So considering all these insights, India's powerful service engine, the absolute necessity of investing in its people, the surprising economic role of democracy, how might this challenge or maybe confirm your own ideas about what really drives economic success for a nation, especially one as vast and diverse as India? And maybe more broadly, what does this mean for the future of global work and the skills that will be needed wherever you happen to be listening from? Something to think about.